Valve Software is well known for their innovative gameplay and iconic stories, but is less recognized for their love of ridiculously oversized facilities and structures. Look no further than Black Mesa, the Citadel, and especially Aperture Science. While the two former facilities are massive in their own right, Aperture's subterranean research facility dwarfs them both. Except, the Aperture Science Enrichment Center isn't just larger than the Citadel and Black Mesa, but rather absolutely gargantuan in scale. Those familiar with both Portal and its sequel will recognize this fact. But what we see simply as players in both games barely shows us the true scale of the facility. By performing copious amounts of math, examining in-game environments, character dialogue, map geometry, ARGs, and unused content, we can get a much clearer picture into not only the size of Aperture Science, but the logistics and technology that allows a facility larger than the island of Manhattan to operate. This is the unimaginable size of the Aperture Science Enrichment Center.
Brain mapping, artificial intelligence. We should have been working on it 30 years ago. You can head on back to your desk.
It's often suggested that based on developer commentary and in-game dialogue, that Portal 2 takes place roughly 50,000 years after the events of the first game. While some debate this, with suggestions that it only takes place 50 years after or even less, we nonetheless have to go decades back in time, even before the original game, to understand the true scale of the facility. In January 1944, a young shower curtain salesman by the name of Cave Johnson decides to purchase a salt mine in the Upper Peninsula of the state of Michigan. It's a rather strange decision, especially with the young Johnson stating that the future is here, and it's under the Earth's crust, with the subtitle of the headline stating that it will bring science industry to Upper Michigan. This would mark the beginning of Aperture Science, which would be founded as Aperture Science Innovators 3 years later in 1947. As a company just starting out, its initial footprint would be absolutely enormous, given its establishment in a former salt mine. If Johnson was seeking to satiate his sodium cravings, this was an excellent solution. The chicken enchilada burrito paired with a steak quesadilla from Taco Bell could easily accomplish this. But Mr. Johnson was not a man captivated with such delicacies. However, if he was instead looking for a large, confined space to build up his new science company, a salt mine actually makes complete sense given their scale. Generally, salt mines encompass long tunnels, huge, cavernous rooms, and generally go hundreds of meters below the surface. What Johnson ultimately possesses is thousands of meters of empty space to build in, leading to the construction of the 9 enrichment shafts that would be seen in the later chapters of Portal 2. What is readily apparent when first arriving at Test Shaft 09, nicknamed Zulu Bunsen, is that the testing spheres in the caves they are constructed within are utterly enormous, and extremely deep underground. Numerous times throughout Chapter 6 and 7, we see infographics showing that the shaft is composed of 9 testing spheres, which mirrors the setup of the remaining 8 enrichment shafts. The seemingly enormous spheres do pose an important question. Exactly how deep underground does the facility go? And do we have to ward off pyrocynical to the presence of these big and round objects? The latter is for a different time, but for the former, our first indication of the depth of the facility comes prior to Wheatley's takeover, when he states that,
"And we're only seeing the top layer! It goes down for miles!"
In addition to Wheatley's dialogue, the plural usage of the word miles, and the newspaper dictating that it's under the Earth's crust, gives us a clear indication that the very bottom of the facility is in fact miles deep, even if the quote from Cave Johnson is just a figure of speech and not meant to be factual. After all, this is coming from a man who created an army of mantis men, allegedly. Further confirmation of the extreme depth of the facility is seen on the walls of the pit that GLaDOS and Chell fall into following Wheatley's takeover, with depths indicating that their fall starts at around 2,875 meters underground, before eventually ending at 4,375 meters, seen right as Chell blacks out. This is the last and only explicit indication as to the depth of the facility, with this depth roughly equating to 2.7 miles. However, in the game's files we can actually find that there is another variant of the sign texture indicating a depth of 5,250 meters, or 3.2 miles. For reference, that's essentially the equivalent of building 5 Burj Khalifas and immediately launching them into the ground. While the Enrichment Center could indeed stretch all the way down to this depth, there's no way to confirm this, especially given that this texture isn't actually used anywhere in the game. We can, however, confirm that the facility does go down 4,375 meters, and this is indicated by signage in the main elevator shaft, as well as the size of the enrichment spheres. After leaving the third sphere in test shaft 09, you can find an inaccessible elevator shaft with a sign that indicates the depth is 4,000 meters below the surface. If we measure the enrichment spheres in the Hammer World editor, we can determine that they have an equal width and height of 78 meters. With Chell having ascended 3 chambers by this point, there is at least a depth of 234 meters from this height in the shaft to the very bottom of the first sphere. The same infographic showing the entirety of the test shaft shows that there are 9 spheres, with seemingly equal distance between them. However, the distance in-game varies depending on what level you're on. In this scenario, we'll go by the infographic, and compare the distance between spheres by measuring them in the map SP-A3 Transition 01. By doing so, we can determine there is a distance of 26 meters between each sphere. And if we multiply this measurement by 3 to account for the distance between the 3 spheres, and the gap below the first one, we get a total height of 312 meters. So what's the importance of this distance? Why does it matter at all when discussing the depth of the facility? Recall the last sign you see while falling in the pit. It shows a depth of 4,375 meters. With a height of 312 meters from the first to third sphere, it proves that this depth marker is largely accurate, and that it couldn't be anywhere near 5,000 meters below ground, at least in test shaft 09. To further confirm this point, we can also measure the distance between the first sphere in the shaft with the water below, which gives us a distance of 48 meters. If you add that to our previous total, we then get a precise height of 350 meters. This means we're only 25 meters off from meeting the exact depth seen during the fall, but we don't actually need to measure anything else. This is because Chell starts to black out right before you can even get a good look at the sign indicating the depth of 4,375 meters. Since we don't see the remainder of Chell's fall after this, we can assume that her fall only continues 25 meters after the fact. Now, I know what you're saying. What if it actually is 5,000 meters below the surface, and she bounces off of a giant trampoline? This is fair, but I raise you a different point. If we continue using the elevator shaft as a reference for the depth of the old facility, we can determine that the entire height of each test shaft roughly tops out at 1,475 meters. We know this because the last depth sign we see in the shaft shows a depth of 2,900 meters. And if we subtract this by the presumed depth of 4,375 meters, we get our new depth. However, if we measure the height of the shaft by using the spheres instead of the elevator signs, we can determine that the total height is 910 meters. We get this number by multiplying the sphere height of 78 meters by 9 times, and the distance of 26 meters between each sphere by 8 times. This effectively means that we're missing 500 meters of space. And while you can certainly grab a few meters here and there given the very distance of the spheres, it doesn't make enough of a difference to make any significant changes to the height. If you consider that we only ever see 7 spheres in test shaft 9, and only even enter 6 to begin with, there is the possibility that the remaining 2 are underneath the first sphere we see upon entering the shaft. Were this to be the case, then that means that the height of the spheres is only 702 meters. And if you further analyze discrepancies between the highest and deepest depth signs, then the logic starts to falter a little bit. Though, no one ever said that Portal was a logical game. If we're going by the actual dimensions in the maps themselves, as we have been thus far, then ultimately, the depth of 4,375 meters is, in fact, accurate. While the depth of the facility is certainly deep, it's also equally plausible that the width of the facility exceeds the depth measurement. We know this based off of the skybox in the opening portion of Chapter 6, known as the Tartaros Pit. If you look beyond the junkyard, you see dozens of large pillars similar to that of the immediate vicinity of Chell. We know that the test shafts themselves span a width of hundreds of meters and are connected by train, as confirmed by a sign near the bottom of test shaft 9. The length of the Tartaros Pit absolutely exceeds the width of all 9 shafts, so there is likely some form of transport from one end of the facility to the other. In the same respect, it's entirely possible that a train connects the modern facility outside of the testing shafts. After all, Black Mesa has a tram, so why wouldn't Aperture? Except, judging by the test chambers hanging just above the pits and the fact that they seem to go on for literal miles, these seem to be more closely associated with the modern-day Enrichment Center rather than the old. This is further proven by the seismic absorbers we see at the very end of Chapter 7 that appear to be supporting the entirety of the modern facility. Which brings us to the modern-day Enrichment Center.
so you may be confused about the passage of time. The point is, yesterday was your birthday. I thought you'd want to know.
Given what we know about the Aperture Science Enrichment shafts, the modern facility is significantly closer to the surface than its predecessor. The exact depth it reaches is somewhat questionable, and this is largely due to the fact that the last marker we see upon leaving the original facility dictates a depth of 2,900 meters. However, in the Tartaros pit we can see modern aperture infrastructure just above, which is assumed to be 4,250 meters below the surface at a minimum. In this instance, let's assume that these are probably hundreds of meters above rather than just being on top of our heads like they are from Cho's perspective. Regardless of how deep the modern facility goes, we do know that it is largely contained near the surface, and isn't below the Earth's crust like the portion built within the salt mines. In fact, it's likely very close to the surface itself, at least with some portions of the facility. While GLaDOS does state that
You're not breathing real air. It's too expensive to pump this far down.
it would indicate that the facility is not right below the surface. However, this still could be the case, and she may literally be saying that even at a small depth, it's cost prohibitive to pump in fresh air from the surface. The more likely scenario is that she's just trying to cause Chell to have an existential crisis due to the lack of exposure to any natural elements like sunlight or air. However, there's more evidence suggesting the modern-day facility's close proximity to the surface than there is not. If we refer to a familiar Wheatley quote,
And we're only seeing the top layer. It goes down for miles.
it is direct confirmation that at least with the portion of the facility that GLaDOS resides in, that they're at the top of the facility, which is likely just below the surface. This is confirmed in part due to the ERC. The ERC, or Extended Relaxation Center, is the first portion of the facility seen at the start of Portal 2, a vast complex filled with relaxation chambers that preserve test subjects for a long period of time, much like Chell. Upon being rescued by Wheatley, his subsequent destruction of the chamber that Chell resides in reveals that this is just one of hundreds of chambers in an absolutely enormous section of the facility. While it certainly appears large as a player going through the game, it happens to be significantly larger than one might anticipate. For one, we know that at a bare minimum there are 10,000 relaxation chambers in the center, which is derived from Wheatley saying that
And whose fault do you think it's going to be when the management comes down here and finds 10,000 flipping vegetables?
Wheatley is likely rounding down or up. I mean, come on, the guy is a moron. But if we take the measurements of a relaxation chamber and apply that to the 3 rows of chambers we see in the skybox, we get a total of 3,828 chambers. We can get a rough estimate of how large the center is, and by rounding the length of each row from 28 to 30 chambers, we can then multiply all 3 rows by 3 to get a length of 69 chambers long, getting us a total of 9,108 chambers. If we add an extra 924 chambers to round it out as close to 10,000 as possible, then we get an absolute length of 83 chambers, which if multiplied by the individual chamber length of 33 feet, gets us a total length of 2,739 feet, roughly half a mile or 834 meters in length. And this is just accounting for the containers themselves rather than the entire center. This is roughly equivalent to the entire length of the Boston Common in the capital city of Massachusetts. It is an enormous facility even by just these numbers, because by measuring the rest of the skybox and the main map itself, we can get an even more accurate representation of the size. In terms of length, the remaining length of the skybox, excluding the chambers, is a total of 2,304 feet, which, combined with the chamber total, means that the absolute length of the entire center is a length of 5,043 feet, nearly a mile, or 1,537 meters. For comparison, this is just slightly shorter than Concourse A at the Detroit Metropolitan Airport, notable for being the second longest airport concourse in the entire world. In the same respect, we can use the same measurements to determine the width and depth of this room. By using the docking station sign as a height reference, the ceiling of the gameplay portion of the ERC is roughly 129 feet above the sign, and stretches down at least 500 feet further, giving us a minimum of 629 feet in height. By measuring the distance between the ceiling and bottom of the chambers in the skybox, we get a height of 1,104 feet, which technically tracks given the portion of the centered shell is found in does not reach the surface, so the extra 500 feet actually compensates perfectly for this difference. You might suggest that these gaps in the ceiling of the Extended Relaxation Center, the dilapidated test chambers from the original game, and the room that GLaDOS is found in aren't actually holes to the surface. I find this suggestion to be odd, because the presence of plants and chirping birds absolutely implies as such. Where would this light source be coming from otherwise? While the facility does have power even in its destroyed state, the proximity to the surface only makes sense. Chell does inflict heavy damage upon the facility at the end of the first game. And if the facility has been left to rot for 50, much less 50,000 years, there's no question that there would be structural damage resulting in the collapse of the ceilings. Further evidence suggesting that this is indeed sunlight comes from when you get the portal gun. If you look up, you find a chart depicting what appears to be phases of the moon, and given that it is centered around a hole in the ceiling, there is no other interpretation to be made here rather than this is indeed a hole to the surface. While going through test chambers and eventually escaping the watchful eye of GLaDOS, we get further glimpses into the scale of the facility. They're albeit not as big as places like the enrichment spheres or the ERC, but our next true glimpse as to the scale of the facility comes from when Wheatley has full control. As Chell and GLaDOS approach Wheatley's lair, a portion of the facility collapses, revealing the true scale of his destruction, and the test chambers that surround him. While these likely aren't the limits of how far the test chambers stretch, I mean for one, we literally go through so many other sections with dozens of test chambers, it gives us a rough estimate of how far these chambers go. The size also varies per chamber. So for consistency, each chamber will be based off of the measurements gathered from chamberfx.mdl. In the same respect, we'll count the amount of test chambers from the model fin3 background elements alt.mdl to determine the rough width and height. There's about 25 chambers from left to right near the top layer, which is seemingly the widest. This means that the chambers stretch to around 2,000 feet wide, or 609 meters. The actual width of the chambers themselves is 1,600 feet, but I've added 400 to accommodate for gaps and extra space. Using the same method, we can determine the height. With 17 chambers reaching from top to bottom, we get a total height of 880 feet, or 268 meters. The height of the chambers alone is 680 feet, but 200 has been added for padding, much like the width. It's been suggested that the orange glow behind the chambers is the sun, but this can't be the case because it would imply that the facility is built off of the side of a cliff. The more likely and realistic scenario is that this is the impending reactor explosion that GLaDOS is trying to stop. After all, the final step to defeating Wheatley is shooting a hole through the ceiling into the night sky onto the moon. So let's say that they are close to the surface, and then that is the sun. That means the moon landing was faked. So what's the surface really like?
Are you trying to escape? Things have changed since the last time you left the building. What's going on out there will make you wish you were back in here.
Unlike its sister series Half-Life, the Portal franchise rarely ever shows us what the surface of the facility is like, and information is limited as to the scale of what might be on the surface. While the facility is overall multiple times larger than their rival Black Mesa, their surface footprint is likely nowhere near the scale of the facility in New Mexico. We can glean this just from the nature of playing the games, because you never interact with anything on the surface as a player. The most explicit view of the surface we see in any of the games is at the very end of the original title, where Chell and GLaDOS lie in the parking lot of the facility, with the only structure in sight being a guardhouse. Beyond the maintenance shed we see at the end of Portal 2, the parking lot on the surface is seemingly the only surface structure with Aperture's branding that exists. While numerous story bits and designs were retconned and changed between the first game and its sequel, we do know that this parking lot, and potentially many more, do exist due to Cave Johnson saying,
Yes, you. Box your stuff. Out the front door. Parking lot. Car. Goodbye.
Beyond parking lots, we can assume that there is likely some above-ground structure to get below the surface. This is a given, especially since there are numerous mentions of elevators to the surface, both in dialogue and in graphics. Though beyond just an entrance, there's also some sort of sun-capturing device, given that GLaDOS states,
These bridges are made from natural light that I pump in from the surface.
Beyond dialogue and the two actual in-game examples we have of surface-level structures in the facility, we do know of one large surface building that potentially exists. I say potentially, because during the run of the Potato Fool's Day ARG, one of the TGA images that was discovered shows an infographic depicting the quote, Aperture Building, a large office structure that bears some resemblance to the design of the Kennedy Space Center, with the largest portion of the building being a tall, almost windowless box. It is also seemingly not the only surface building for the company, given the sign that indicates it is Aperture Science Laboratories Building 0064A, with the specific numbering suggesting this is one of many. This is the only official art known to exist that shows a surface structure for the company, seemingly referred to as Aperture Laboratories, with an extra A. There's actually another TGA file from the ARG that depicts concepts of the ruined chamber that GLaDOS resides in. Given that she and Shell both ascend into the air at the end of the first game, and eventually end up in a parking lot, it's not too much of a stretch to assume that the central AI chamber is literally underneath a parking lot. After all, in this very same concept art we can see that the sky is open with sunlight streaming in, with a car among the ruins of the facility. While we know that the primary facility for the company resides in Upper Michigan, the data retrieved by Alex and Gordon in Half-Life 2 Episode 2 reveals the schematics for the Borealis, an Aperture Science research ship that bears some significant secret that could aid the resistance against the Combine. As Alex, Gordon, Dr. Kleiner, and Eli review the data, one image in particular indicates the existence of the Aperture Science Labs and Administration Assisted Jaunt Center, located in Cleveland, Ohio. With both the Borealis schematic and the Potato Fool's Day TGA file, it is entirely possible that the primary facility is largely underground, with additional facilities across the Great Lakes region. This evidence seemingly suggests as such, although it is worth pointing out that Episode 2 preceded the release of Portal 2 by 4 years, and we know from the Ship Overboard Easter egg that the Borealis was likely constructed 4,000 meters underground in the Michigan facility.
Now she'll argue. She'll say she can't. She's modest like that, but you make her.
We're still doing science, sir.
It is likely obvious that determining the absolute size of the Aperture Science Enrichment Center is effectively impossible. Even by researching beyond the 2 mainline Portal games, it's difficult to actually get a limit to the size of the facility. As we see in the Tartaros Pit, the Extended Relaxation Center, and outside of Wheatley's central AI chamber, the facility seemingly stretches on for literal miles. Given that the enrichment shafts are connected by train, and even considering how big they are on their own, the modern facility is absolutely larger by width and length. With this in mind, it likely also has some form of transportation, especially given the insane size of the facility. Mods like Portal Revolution and Portal Stories Mel were not taken into account for this video, but I find their interpretations of the facility to make a lot of sense, especially with Mel showcasing more of what the surface is actually like. Though, until we get the next Half-Life game, or if we ever get another Portal game, we're likely never going to know the true scale of Aperture Science. But at the very least, we know this place is just enormous. So no matter what, do not tell Pyrocynical about its size. If he ever learns, God help us. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like, and make sure to subscribe! It really helps out the channel, and it helps me get these videos out faster. Why? I don't know. You can theorize, and tell me in the comments why you think it benefits me. If you want to keep up to date with the release of all of my videos, and get some juicy behind the scenes looks, consider following me on Blue Sky. As always, take care of yourself. And remind loved ones how much you appreciate them. And you know why? Because we can always use a little bit more love in the world. Take care.